Welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about a paper that I wrote in graduate school and published recently as a first author. One of my goals today is to show you all that scientific papers don't have to be that hard to understand, and a lot of the time they are actually pretty interesting. This document here is a preprint manuscript PDF. We're not supposed to share PDFs of the full published versions, but I can definitely provide a link to the journal where this is published for anyone who is interested. My paper was titled National Liquefaction Loss Database and Event Level Fragility Functions. Start off with giving a little bit of a background on liquefaction. So liquefaction is a natural phenomenon where a block of soil temporarily acts as a liquid instead of a solid, meaning that any infrastructure on top of it can be damaged. For example, any houses or roads or bridges that are on top of soil when it liquefies can get damaged pretty easily. The physical settings for how you make liquefaction happen is you have a bunch of loose, large grains of soil, oftentimes different types of sand, which are filled with water. Normally, when soil is not going through liquefaction, the soil stays in place because there are contact stresses between the soil grains holding those grains together. However, sometimes a force, such as earthquake shaking wave, can come in and slam into that block of soil, and it raises the pore water pressure, which is the pressure of that water between those large, chunky grains of soil. So it raises the pore water pressure until the pore water pressure is higher than the contact stresses holding the soil grains together. And that ends up suspending the soil grains in the water, and the block of soil temporarily acts as a liquid instead of a solid. Liquefaction as a whole usually occurs on the scale of a few inches up to a few feet in some really rare cases. So as a result, it rarely causes fatalities. But even a few inches of offset to a home, for example, is enough to necessitate major repairs. So first up in this paper, we're going to talk about the abstract and touch on each of the other sections in this afterwards. An abstract is usually provided to give a summary of everything done in the research project. So for this paper, our primary goal was to create a data set quantifying historical liquefaction in the US. And our secondary goal was to use these numbers to predict how much liquefaction we're going to get in future US events if we know the shaking amounts and where that shaking is going to occur. A quick side note about abstracts is that if you're in a time crunch and you want to check out a bunch of papers quickly to see which are important and which are worth looking to further, I always found it really helpful to start with the abstract, and then if you find the abstracts of 5 or 6 papers you think might be relevant, then you can go into the conclusions and see which results are most relevant to the project you're looking at. And those two sections alone will usually give you some pretty good big picture highlights of the goals and results of any paper you're looking at. And then you can use that, of course, to decide whether or not you want to read the methods and data and other sections of the paper. Moving on from the abstract here. So the next section we're going to look at briefly is going to be the introduction section. So here I discuss the importance of our paper and outline some of the details that we find, including something I mentioned earlier where typical liquefaction deformation is going to be on the order of a handful of centimeters. Also in the introduction, I talk a little bit about some of the methods and approaches that we use to data collection and data analysis and predictions later on. This is still a pretty high level approach of everything. We go into a little more detail than the abstract, and I start defining terms, starting to cite some of the papers that we use for background, and setting up the data collection sections. So my second official section just named it as data. It has a couple of subsections within it. Broadly speaking, this is the area where people talk about how and why they collected the data that they do. A big part of my project was built off of some projects previously completed in our research group. In those previously completed projects, the authors would split a region affected by an earthquake shaking into a bunch of grid cells and then predicted the percent of each grid cell expected to liquefy. The first data collection part of my project that I did was to use those formulas to try estimating the total area in square kilometers expected to liquefy for each event, specifically the historical events that we were looking at. This was done by taking the percent probability of each cell liquefying, multiplying it by the cell's area, adding those values up across a region, and then that would give us the total area expected to liquefy. Going forward, we can think about that as our main explanatory variable. In other words, we can try to predict the amount of liquefaction loss by using the amount of area expected to liquefy in an event. At this stage, I also created a second explanatory variable called population exposure. To get this, we go back to the map of percent of each cell expected to liquefy. We multiply that percent by the population in each grid cell, and then we add that up across a region. In other words, if 10% of a cell is expected to liquefy and that cell has 1,000 people in it, we can expect 100 people to be exposed to liquefaction in the event. Add that up for every cell across a region, and you get the total number of people in Seattle exposed to liquefaction, for example, in a Seattle-based earthquake. As I mentioned, this is going to be a second variable that we can use to predict the estimated liquefaction losses later on. Next up, we have section 2.2, which is still considered part of data collection. So here I talk about how we developed the liquefaction loss database itself. Basically, we gathered all events with magnitude greater than 5.0 in the US, without including Hawaii, between the years of 1964 and 2019. Looking at all those events, I went through a bunch of reports for each of them to figure out which events had liquefaction, what pieces of infrastructure were damaged, and I tried to estimate losses for each of them. We ended up finding 42 total events, 17 US events where liquefaction was observed, and 11 of which had liquefaction-induced damages. So what we mean by that is there can be an event where we see liquefaction, but it occurs in an open field or something that does not need any infrastructure replacement. So there is a fair amount of detail in this section that I'm not going to go into. I'm going to touch on a quick example of how I estimated losses to a parking lot which was damaged by liquefaction. So here we have a picture of a parking lot as well as a formula underneath it for how I estimated losses, total replacement value for this liquefaction-induced damage. Broadly speaking, the way we approached items like this was taking the cost per square foot of a parking lot of this type and then multiplying it by the approximate square footage that needs replacement found using Google Maps. Multiply that by the damage ratio. So the damage ratio is going to be how much of the parking lot needs replacement. In this case, I believe the text cited that the full parking lot needed to be replaced. So that's going to be 1.0. If it was only half the parking lot needs to be replaced, it would have been 0.5, for example. Lastly, we multiplied that by area modification factor. So this parking lot was in, I think, the city of Nisqually in Washington State. So that's going to have an area modification factor of 1.11, which means that the construction cost for replacement of that item is going to be 11% higher than the national average. Multiply those values together, and we get a replacement value of approximately $181,000. We went through and did that for around 300 items of damage across the 11 events in the US with liquefaction-induced damage historically. After that database was created, we went and produced a series of tables and figures with some of the data. What I want to touch on is going to be this figure 3 here. For those listening, I'm going to describe it the best I can. We have a double bar chart here where bars on the right in gray represent log total liquefaction costs, and stacked bars on the left represent the liquefaction cost per category of each of those events. Basically, this allows us at a glance to see what range of liquefaction losses we get in each of the events. In addition, for each of those events, how much is composed of building damage, how much is transportation damage, how much is utility damage. So for example, we can see that some of the biggest events, 1964 Alaska and 1989 Loma Prieta, are composed of majority transportation damages, in addition to some of the events with middle of the road losses, such as 2002 Denali and 2001 Nisqually. So that would allow us to focus more on transportation going forward. The next thing I'm going to touch on is going to be figure 7. Figure 7 and 8 have a fair amount going on, but we're gonna try and focus in on a couple of these to make them clearer. Figures 7 and 8 are basically scatter plots showing log liquefaction costs versus the predictor variables, which are going to be area expected to liquefy in each event in figure 7, and then figure 8, I'll scroll to in a second, is showing population expected to be affected by liquefaction. So broadly speaking, very happy when we first plotted these out that we see for events with liquefaction damage, yes, increasing area exposed to liquefaction and increasing population exposed to liquefaction leads to more damages, especially in the total and transportation, which were the ones that we were most concerned about. Also included in these plots are a bunch of events along the bottom, which are going to be the remainder of the 42 US events greater than magnitude 5.0, where those events did not have any liquefaction losses associated with them. So when we created lines of best fit using linear regression, showed here in black, those points were included to make sure that we were not biasing our results towards events only with liquefaction damage. The reason for that is that in reality, when we're given a brand new event, we will not know in advance whether it has liquefaction damage or not. So it's better to not assume anything and create lines of best fit, including both events with liquefaction damage and events without. Scrolling down here, we have lines of best fit and scatter plots for population exposure. So then if we look a little closer in the text, the authors and I talked about some of the differences between the plots and where the pros and cons fall. I'm not going to go into the details here, but we can look into those further later on. The next table right underneath this has R squared and p-values for those single linear regression lines. Of course, most of the time linear regression, if we want to perfect that, can also be done with multiple variables. It can be done using polynomial regression, which is nonlinear, and we can make it fancier and fancier if wanted. The next section here is going to be called methodology. So this is all about the methodology of how we built fragility functions and how we use those to predict liquefaction losses. Fragility functions are similar to logistic regression, where we're able to variable value on a continuous scale For example, if we're looking at area exposed to liquefaction, we have 0 up to thousands of square kilometers that we might be looking at, and use those values to get a probability of exceeding a dollar loss value. Here I call them damage state thresholds. So damage state 0 is under $10,000. Damage state 1 is over 10,000. Damage state 2 is over 1 million, etc. There are going to be a lot of equations and details involved in this section, so I'm not going to go into it too much here. A lot of coding went into this as well, so hopefully someone takes a look at it at some point in life and gets some use out of it. But for now, we're going to try to avoid getting bogged down in the details and skim over it, possibly come back to it in a later episode if anyone's interested. Section 4, I'm going to go to next, which talks a little bit about some of the limitations of this project. Actually, I'm going to show the fragility functions real quick just for everyone to get a sense of them for anybody watching. As I mentioned earlier, we can use the explanatory values of area exposed to liquefaction to get a probability of exceeding each damage state. So the blue is going to be probability of exceeding damage state 1, which is the $10,000 mark. Green is exceeding damage state 2, $1 million mark. And we have those created for each category along with total. Section 4, limitations, is going to be about some of the limitations to consider when using the data or results produced in this project. I actually found limitations my favorite part of working on this project. It was a time when I could reflect back on everything I had done, read it over again in detail, and try to pick it apart for any possible improvements. Finding things we could have done differently was a little disheartening at first, but I found myself really enjoying the process as a way to help others with liquefaction and fragility functions in the future. As much as I like to think this was a perfect project, of course I understand there's lots of limitations that can come into play. One of the biggest that I mentioned first here is that the loss estimates made in the study have a lot of inherent uncertainty with them, and of course then carry those uncertainties into some of the fragility functions. Secondarily, author subjectivity involved with how much of a damage ratio to assign to certain pieces of infrastructure, for example, definitely come into play here as well. We tried to account for that using some confidence intervals associated with the fragility functions. Depending on those use case requirements of whatever people are trying to use them for, those confidence intervals may be too large. Conversely, the intervals are not necessarily guaranteed to even account for all of our uncertainty, so they may be too small for other uses. More observations of liquefaction-induced losses in US events would continue refining and minimizing those confidence intervals so that we can get better fragility functions for whatever people want to use them for going forward. Another big limitation of the study is that the loss estimates made describe only direct repair costs and do not account for indirect losses due to downtime, lack of economic activity, and they also don't account for damage to contents within building structures. Downtime, indirect losses are going to be how much money a damaged store loses if it has to be closed for repairs for 6 months, for example. Indirect losses to retail locations are actually kind of straightforward to estimate because a lot of people have looked at that before. And so a lot of that information is publicly available. However, indirect losses get much more challenging and have a lot more uncertainty when we talk about bridges or highways or utilities that get damaged, so we chose not to include them here. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about our conclusion section. As I mentioned earlier, the conclusion section is going to be similar to the abstract, where we talk about the broad strokes of what the project is doing. And then we also give some details on the results of our studies and highlight some numbers that we want people to walk away with understanding. Lastly, we make some recommendations on how the results of our study can be used in the future. Thank you all for listening. I hope you all enjoyed this and learned something interesting today.